Hello, everybody. Welcome to the launch event of the Global Smart City Index 2021. Soon we will move to our panel discussion, but I will use this initial few minutes to present the main results of the report. So let me just mention very quickly, without going into the details of the slide, that the index relies on a methodology that we've been using in previous years. Surveys, about 15,000 people have been surveyed in a total of 115 cities around the world, along different dimensions of what a smart city could be. The most important element is to keep in mind is that this index is not technocentrist. It is human-centric. We ask people how they feel about living in the city and how technology can indeed help solve some of the issues they face. But we start with the issues and not with the solutions. That's one of the specifics of the Smart City Index. This year, and this is the results you've been waiting for, here is the top 10. We have Singapore again as number one, so congratulations and a round of applause for Singapore. Third year in a row, quite remarkable, followed by Zurich, Oslo, Taipei, and Lausanne. This is the top five, and there's a lot we can discuss about that. It is quite remarkable that in those top 10, we have indeed 3 Swiss cities. And there's a lot of stability otherwise, in spite of what happened around the pandemic. Again, our panel discussion will allow us to go a bit deeper in what that means. In each of the regions of the world, we have leaders. So in North America, New York comes on top, rank 12th. In the Middle East, it's Abu Dhabi, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I encourage you to look in details at the report to see where your city is and how it ranks best in terms of the various indicators we use. This is the way the report looks like. So taking the example of Singapore, this year's number one again, we have typically a double page, and all of that is accessible for free on the internet. So just Google Smart City Index, imd-sutd, and this is where you will be directed. And you will see that in addition to the generic information about where the city is, how big it is, etc., we have at the bottom of the page, the double page, 2 big groups of indicators: structures on the left side and technologies on the right side. And basically, the ability of technologies to answer the needs of the population is to be found on the right side. We add information on top of that, which you can find at the top right of this double page, about the priority areas for a particular city. We compare that with the evaluation we get from this group of similar cities in terms of income per capita, in terms of region. So there's a number of ways in which you can play around with the data. Another way to present it, and I'm going here to take another example, not to be always speaking about Singapore, our number one, but looking at Zurich as our number 2. There are infographics that describe a city in terms of where the strong points are, where the weak points are, where the scores are. And we've chosen to represent that in a rather figurative way, where these buildings you have on the left side represent the structures, the buildings on the right side more the technologies, and the height of these buildings will vary in terms of scores. So you have in blue the area where a country scores particularly high, So for Zurich, it would be medical services and children's access to education. And in purple, those areas which are more areas of concern, where more improvements can be contemplated. And in the case of Zurich, it would be the cost of housing. It will also be transparent governance and safety to some extent. We can do that in a number of ways, but I will stop the presentation here to move directly to what is the core of the event today, that is our panel presentation. Starting with Cheong Koon Hean. Koon Hean is the chair of SUTD's Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities. So welcome, Koon Hean. We have Alice Charles from the World Economic Forum, where Alice leads the Cities, Infrastructure and Urban Services Platform. Koon Hean is in Singapore, and I take it, Alice, that you're in Geneva.
That's correct.
And
hi, everyone.
Our third panelist is Hazem Galal. And Hazem, who is today in Dubai, is a partner and global leader for cities and local government at PwC Middle East. So welcome to the three of you. As you heard from this brief presentation, we have the rankings, and this is what has started making the headlines in a number of newspapers and magazines around the world. But we would like this discussion to take us away from the rankings. That is, to have an in-depth discussion of what a smart city can be, should be, what are the main issues that all cities have to face, and why smart cities may be better positioned than others to deal with them. And all of that under the title of Facing New Emergencies. And new emergencies are not just COVID, they include climate emergencies, and they include a number of other challenges that cities have to face. We will try to make this panel as dynamic as possible. So my hope is that you will feel free to jump in and raise your hand when you want to intervene, and that we can have exchanges among panelists rather than just a succession of questions from the moderator to the panelists. Let me start with a generic question, just to kickstart the discussion. We've been living a very interesting period, to say the least, over the last 18 months. What have been your own challenges in whichever city you happen to live? Could you give us an example of what you believe is symptomatic of what happened during these last 18 months, and how things have been different, maybe from other parts of the world, in your own city? Maybe starting with you, Koon Hean.
Thank you, Bruno, and hello to everyone from Singapore. Well, I think for me, the pandemic really has highlighted that cities need to build up our resilience to pandemic and environmental risk. And at the same time, really many elements in a city cannot be changed so easily to deal with these risks and forces, because much of our physical and economic structure just cannot be changed. But digital solutions really can add a dimension of speed and responsiveness to the city, and to give it a level of agility to adapt and to adjust. So I'm just going to cite two quick examples in our case. When COVID-19 hit Singapore in early 2020, we really faced a huge logistic challenge of having to distribute masks to everyone in Singapore. So our engineers took 4 days to develop an app called Supply Ally to facilitate the distribution of 4.4 million masks to the public. And we also developed another app called Safe Entry and Trace Together for more efficient contact tracing to minimize the virus spread. So we were able to bring the time between exposure and quarantine from more than 4 days to about 1.5 days or less for the contact tracing. So I would say that going forward, really for us, resilience must really become an additional consideration in the development of smart cities.
Thank you, Koon Hean. So thank you for underlining also the interdependence between environmental issues and health issues. Alice, from your part of the world.
So I guess from a very personal perspective, I'm a working mother. So, once creches and schools closed down, parents certainly had a nightmare. So we really realized the value that our educators and our providers of childcare have in the city-related system. So that was certainly something from a very personal context. And the other thing is, I live in Geneva. So Geneva is a city that has a huge population of expats. So those of us who are expats and work in international organizations are not connected to the city system. So information wasn't coming our way. So I think, one of the big difficulties that we experienced in the expat community, first of all, was we didn't have information, right? So I think the city learned from that early on and started to build tools and mechanisms, and they made sure that they were, connecting with every embassy or mission, as we call them, to the United Nations, connecting with the international institutions and ensuring that information was getting out there. So, it shows you the importance of recognizing the various groups within your city. And many cities experienced that, who had minority groups, and how to get information to them, how to get them vaccinated. So, it shows the importance of an inclusive approach to any kind of emergency situation that arises. But I think in the context of what we're talking about today, I think one of the remarkable things that we've seen was the resilience of cities, which was underpinned by technology. So we've seen them go to a virtual world very, very quickly and deliver services that they traditionally offered in person in a digital world. And that was certainly the case in Geneva as well. And I think cities around the world have to be complimented for that very quick transition. And it certainly provides an opportunity to build on what they've already done, in the last 18 months and continue on that journey.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you for echoing the words that Koon Hean was just using about agility, showing the ability to engineer these reactions in a swift and efficient way. Hazem, you're not a working mother, but you live in a place that also has a high percentage of expats. So what else can you tell us about your own experience during the pandemic?
So it's been quite an interesting journey, Bruno. I mean, Dubai is a tourism and business and travel hub, not only for the Middle East region, but globally as well. And it was very interesting because, as you mentioned, there's a very large number of expats whose families would typically, in the summer, go back to Europe or to wherever they're from over the month of the summer. So during, the summer of 2020, it was quite interesting because in many ways we had to rediscover what Dubai has to offer. As many people did a lot of what we used to call staycations. We're very lucky that the level of trust here in the government is very high. So whether it was the vaccination, whether it was actually the initial lockdown for, a few days or weeks early on in the pandemic, it was very interesting to see, with almost 200 different nationalities living in one city, how everybody came together, and followed what was the guidance and the policy from the government, stuck with that, we have among the highest vaccination rates in the world. And in many ways, we have been hosting the expo since October 1st, with many people from all over the world flying in, enjoying their experience, complying with, the masks and the vaccinations and the PCRs. So in many ways, we didn't suffer as a city as many as other cities around the world. And to Alice's point, much of that also links to the technological preparedness. A very large percentage of transactions within the Dubai government had gone online through the efforts of, the Smart Dubai office, prior to COVID. So when this happened, the schools, took it on, the government transactions. I actually bought real estate during COVID and they didn't even have to go to an office. It was all done online, right? So that's the kind of preparedness that when cities have invested upfront, they reap the benefits during the crises and show their resilience.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hazem. And I was struck by the word you use of rediscovering the city. I think that all of us, wherever we live in the world, to a large extent, we have been rediscovering our respective cities. Having been in Paris most of that time, I did rediscover the city of Paris. Lockdown had many negative aspects, but the fact that after curfew, you had no cars in the streets, you could see the buildings you had never seen before and the river and everything, that gives you a new angle to some of the nice cities that maybe we had forgotten before the crisis. So thank you for that. Let me now go back to Koon Hean with a very direct question, if I may, about Singapore. Because Singapore is again the leading city this year. And before joining SUTD, which happened earlier this year, you had exercised high-level responsibilities in the urban administration of the city of Singapore. So I would like you to take your former cap and tell us of your way of summarizing that success story.
Thanks, Bruno. Well, actually, Singapore started our smart city journey. Actually, it's not that long ago. It was in 2014. And the transformation has been really quite deliberate and systematic. And it's really driven largely by a very proactive government that put in place a very comprehensive vision and plan. But, the objectives for us really is to use smart digital technologies to help solve all our real life problems. We want to overcome our resource constraints and try to improve people's lives and help businesses to thrive. So in a nutshell, really, the smart nation, we call ourselves smart nation rather than smart city because we are a very small city state. So it is really the smart nation aspiration. It really has three simple pillars. It's about developing a digital economy, a digital government, and a digital society. So the digital economy really means that we want to accelerate the digitalization of industries to help the businesses to become more competitive. Digital government is quite obvious. We want the government services to be very well integrated and really easily accessible to support citizens and the business sector. And of course, when we talk about digital society, actually the key is to ensure digital inclusion. And we have tried to develop what we call a digital readiness blueprint to expand and enhance digital access for everyone and to improve digital literacy by training a lot of people to use digital services and tools. And under this umbrella of the three pillars, really, we did a lot of the verticals, deep dives to develop applications, which many cities do in transport, in home and environment, in business productivity, to take care of health and aging, and public sector projects. And actually, right across all this, there are some critical enablers. We had to develop, for example, a national digital identity to get people to transact using digital services, for example. So I suppose today, really, we've had pretty good progress, and there is very wide adoption of digital technology in almost every aspect of our lives. And of course, the pandemic accelerated that, right? But it has led to greater convenience, efficiency, and reliability of many services in Singapore.
Thank you. So being a city-state has helped. That is, it was not just what the city was doing, with what the government was leading into this digitization of Singaporean society.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Koon Hean. Alice, the World Economic Forum has been at the forefront very early of dealing with these city-related issues. Looking at what happened over the last 2 years, with this health and climate emergencies coming more and more to the front. From your point of view, what are the key lessons drawn, very globally, for cities around the world?
So I suppose the very first point is you never know what the next shock is going to be in your city. So you need to be prepared for all types of eventualities. And, you're not necessarily going to be able to anticipate what the next COVID-19 pandemic, sort of shock that your city is going to face will be. So you've got to be prepared, first of all. And I think, what we certainly have learned is the need for systemic digitalization in our city. So we have seen that cities have been able to very quickly, in the worst possible circumstances, embrace technology and move to the provision of infrastructure and services online. And I guess what we have seen is that they have been able to do that shift in a way generally which has been, ethical and inclusive. So we need to continue on that journey. I think the second thing is, particularly when we think about, issues like climate change in particular, technology is very much an enabler. And I think we need to learn from the mistakes that were made in the early days of the smart city sort of industry, if you like, where there we've seen technology companies developing widgets and gadgets and, going to meet CTOs in cities and seeking to sell those widgets and gadgets and saying, okay, they are the silver bullet that's going to solve your problem. But one thing they forgot was that they weren't actually asking the city, what are your citizens telling us are your problems? So I guess what we are now seeing, and this is particularly going to be the case in terms of addressing climate change, is that we're seeing that cities are looking very carefully at what their citizens need, the future shocks that's coming down the line that they need to adapt to, and they're embracing technology very much as an enabler. So, for example, if you think about climate change, technology can enable the digitalization of our electricity grid systems. It can enable, smart technology systems to be adopted in buildings, for example. So it can help us to drive overall change. But I guess the other thing just to think about in terms of cities designing for future scenarios, we need to understand the strategic role of data. So, cities need to analyze data to make evidence-based decisions, but also they can analyze data to see how they can better offer services and infrastructure within their cities. But I suppose, one of the things in listening to the example of Singapore that I'm struck by is the fact that we have real leadership buy-in and governance. So, we need to have leadership within cities demanding this change, putting the relevant expertise in place to enable the change, but also ensuring that there's adequate budget allocated to enabling technology to be utilized in cities around the world.
Thank you very much, Alice. Now turning to Hazem, Alice just underlined the importance of local leadership. And before that, Koon Hean told us that actually the smart city strategy had not started until 2014. So the UAE and Dubai in particular are a place where leadership has been visibly taking the side of developing a smart city and doing it in an accelerated fashion in a relatively short time span. So from the point of view of PwC, that is a private company with a global footprint that has been involved again for a long time in city issues, what are the lessons that you take from the experience of Dubai or the Middle East or beyond to tell us what is the way in which smart cities should be expected to move after COVID?
Yeah, Bruno, I mean, whether it's Dubai or Abu Dhabi, I mean, both cities have invested quite a bit, in their digital connectivity. And, it's not only about technology. As we know, smart cities have to be, at the end of the day, people-centric to really address the needs of, the city's residents or visitors. And in many ways, some of the lessons learned are about, how do you actually navigate that journey, learn from others, learn from your own actions, and simply always adjust that journey. When Dubai, for example, started its smart city journey, we had so many fragmented apps. Every single department created an app, and they thought that was going to be the solution to a smart city. And very shortly after that, a consolidation started to happen. They created the right governance. They created the standards, the right, and leadership came fully behind these efforts. And that led really to, the next phase of maturity, if you will, of all of these smart city use cases, and not only learning and using government data, but also combining this with private sector data, because if you are trying to plan mobility or even understand how your city works, you will need data, from ride-sharing companies, from mobile operators, all of these data sets coming together in a way that really allows you to understand how the city operates in a dynamic way at different times of the day, and to start to cater to these kind of needs. And we're at the point pre-COVID where you're able to understand even the visitor behavior patterns from credit card data and other sort of like hotel and airline data. You would know that, the British would like to, go to the beach. Usually, of course, we're generalizing, but as a group, they would like to maybe, go to shopping malls during this time of their visit. They usually plan their trips with 6 or 7 month notice. So all of these things, by using data and technology in a good way, without sacrificing privacy, of course, we're talking about anonymized sets of data and GDPR and all of that, you're able to understand behaviors and, most importantly, provide the right set of services. And I think that's what Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and other cities in the Middle East here are really starting to do. And in many ways, the response to COVID, being able to very quickly track who's vaccinated, who's not vaccinated, and to be able to link that, to access to buildings and to even mobility and getting permits and all of that. When you had to get out of your house, even during lockdown time, all you had to do is send a request online and you would get that request granted in less than a half hour. So it's been a journey of learning, adjusting, prototyping, and constantly evolving.
Okay. So I think that this degree of constant evolution, adapting to the new realities and new technological solutions is clearly part of the examples we've heard since the beginning of this discussion. And by parenthesis, I'm always struck by the fact that the people who most easily get sunburns are the first to rush to the beach, but that's a generic observation. Turning back to Koon Hean, it's very difficult to fall in love with somebody who is perfect. It's a bit scary, a perfect person. Singapore seems to be doing everything right. So do you think that the experience, the success of Singapore is replicable in other parts of the world? And if so, what are the areas where you think different cities who are not there yet, who are just beginning their journey as a smart city, could find inspiration in the experience of Singapore?
Well, definitely we're not perfect, and it's really a work in progress. And we learned a lot along the way. And as Hazem said, when we first started the journey, I think many people were very enamored by just doing a lot of apps. But we learned a couple of lessons along the way, and really we found that having a very clear, bold vision that's very broad-based and integrated, that means not siloed and citizen-centric, is actually a very important guiding light in how we develop the digital journey for us. And we also found that we need to put a lot of what we call critical enablers in place to make this vision become a reality. And we soon found out what some of these critical enablers are. And there's really also a need to be future focused. So for example, we also face many challenges. Firstly, how do you develop physical and digital infrastructure to make smart scalable in a cost efficient way? So, for example, a major challenge is that we actually have existing infrastructure in the city. So how do you add that layer of digital infrastructure in a cost-effective way? So a lot of people use, for example, lampposts, right? How do you convert lampposts to put on sensors and use the power source? So these are things we learned along the way. And it's really also about being future-focused. We have to continually invest in the R&D to boost the infrastructure, and technology is moving so fast. So it is a continuous journey. I think one big challenge we face is in winning hearts. I call it winning hearts. Because, how do you persuade people to adopt technology and change lifestyles to ensure digital inclusiveness? Because if we don't, then we have a very big digital divide, and it will exacerbate those inequalities in society. So there's a lot of training, teaching, persuading. And so we did this thing called a digital readiness blueprint, right? We try to enhance access. We even have digital ambassadors to increase digital literacy among the elderly. So they go out and teach the elderly how to use the smartphone, how do you do e-payments. We went to the markets and taught the hawkers how to get onto e-payment systems, how to reach out to e-platforms, because especially with COVID, there are less people going to the markets, how do you sell your stuff, you see? So there's a lot of teaching. And in schools, we had to make sure that all students actually have a laptop because they now have to learn online. So it's really constant. And how do we give people assurance that their data will be protected? So we had to put in place what I call these critical enablers, like policies and standards and regulations to protect data usage, for example. So, all these are needed. And we still face another very big challenge. I'm sure other cities face it too, is that there really is insufficient talent and skilled workforce for the new digital economy. We need a lot of people to develop this new digital economy. So there's a lot of training and reskilling that we need to do. So I think these are some of the types of challenges that we are still facing and we're trying to overcome. So it's a work in progress.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Koon Hean. But indeed, many cities around the world can find inspiration, not just in the successes of those cities that are in the top of the rankings, but also in their failures, in their hesitation, in their trying and failing and trying something else. So thank you for being so candid about it and sharing it with us. Let me take it from there and asking both Alice and Hazem a question that goes along the lines of what Koon Hean was mentioning right now. The importance of dealing with digital inclusion, of not creating digital divides. There's clearly possibilities that COVID may have aggravated some of the international digital divide. The majority of the world population is living and will be living even more in cities in the future. And the majority of that population is in emerging countries. So let's spend a minute looking especially at the examples of cities around the world in the emerging part of the world economy. What would you say are, let's say, the top 3 priorities that cities that do not have the technology right now, that do not have all the solutions, should focus on? So Alice, do you want to give us your 3 priorities?
So what I'm going to focus on is, first of all, the fact that, cities in the global south have an opportunity to leapfrog several stages of development if they do use enabling technology in their development journey. So, they have the opportunity not to make many of the mistakes that we made already in the more developed global north. And they, their cities are the cities that are going to expand and grow rapidly over the next 20 or 30 years, whereas many of our cities are in the global north are going to shrink. But I think the advice that I would give them relates to 3 things. One, to think about the internal governance and capabilities and processes that they need to put in place if they're going to utilize enabling digital technology. 2, to think about the external stakeholders that they need to engage with, from citizens to those that they need to develop partnerships with. And 3, focus on delivery excellence. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail in each of them to, say what I mean by that. So the first thing is, I think cities need to establish digital leadership within their city. So, ideally, somebody that's a CTO or a CIO or a chief digital officer. So somebody that can lead, that can develop a vision, and that can ensure that there's a cross-departmental relationship when it comes to the deployment of technology. I think the next thing to say is every city is unique. And I constantly seen, when we focused on a widget and gadgets approach to the deployment of technology, that solutions that were being developed for the West Coast of the United States did not work when they were being, supposedly implemented in a tropical climate, for example, in cities in India. So in that context, what I would say is, yes, there are learnings from the Singapores of this world, but if you're in Mumbai, you have a unique context, and you need to understand the needs of your citizens and develop solutions that will meet your unique context. So find your flavor, it's critically important. I think the other thing is you need to do the inside job in terms of not only developing digital literacy amongst your civil servants within your city, but also citizens. And in many cases, there's going to be an accessibility problem here. So I think there's opportunities to think about how you could work with some of maybe the existing corporates within your city to upcycle technology and give it to people who are often, in more impoverished communities so they can get access to technology. Access is as critical as digital literacy in many of our more impoverished cities around the world. But also, I think the city has the opportunity to, really use data, explore the strategic role of data. And by that, I mean, for example, a city can leverage data to make evidence-based decisions on city planning to create more compact cities. Or a city can use data to offer services like childcare places or school places, etc., if they analyze data. So it can mean that they're offering these services in a more fast and efficient way. So that's just some of the internal governance capabilities and processes. In terms of external stakeholders, it's absolutely critical that a city understands particularly the more vulnerable groups in their society. So they're reaching out to these groups and understanding their needs, as well as wider society, to understand specific needs, for example, of elderly populations, disabled populations, migrants, children, etc. So in terms of developing their digital strategy, they are developing a strategy that's inclusive. But it's also critical to identify the partnerships that you need to get to success, whether they're academic, whether they're business, or whether they're with civil society institutions. And a city needs to explore that in their external stakeholder engagement. I think my third and final point is around delivery excellence. So what am I getting at there? So basically, I think you need to start with a needs-based approach. So what is the use case that you're looking to deploy the solution in? You need to design for privacy and ensure that you're protecting the rights of your citizens. But you also need to deploy solutions in an agile way. So be prepared to test, to learn, or to scale, or to test and fail and learn from it and make sure that you're not going to fail again. So, create an environment that's agile in terms of its attitude to risk as well. And finally, I think it's important to actively manage change within a city. So, one of the things, for example, is if you're testing solutions within a city, ensure citizens are able to interact with it. So they're able to give guidance on the policy changes that need to happen at the city level. So just to summarize again, the 3 areas I'm suggesting cities focus on is internal governance capabilities and processes, engaging external stakeholders, and focus on delivery excellence.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you for this very detailed answer on these each of these 3 components. I hope that leaves you some room, Hazem, to spell out the room 3 priorities.
No, I fully agree with what Alice mentioned, but I'll name another 3 that are also very important. And I'll start maybe with the funding. You know, we talked about the funding gap in infrastructure for a very long time, and this funding gap manifests itself even further in developing countries and cities. So the ability to bridge that gap and to make sure, you know, that there are national programs. I mean, I remember, you know, back in 2012, you know, I was in Singapore and giving, you know, a speech on smart cities, and I was asked by an Indian reporter if smart cities have a potential in India. And I kind of like hesitated for a few seconds whether I should say something positive or negative. And I did say, yes, yeah, it has a you know, potential. Fast forward a few months, Prime Minister Modi comes in. We have the 100 Smart Cities program with national funding, with competition between cities and regions to stimulate them to innovate and to help match their funds. So it's very important at the end of the day that we think about who's going to pay for this, how are we going to create the partnerships and the business models with the private sector so that the city government or the national government don't have to bear the full burden? How do we work with multilateral development banks so that we're able to have access to some of that funding in a transparent and cost-effective way? So the funding is going to be very important, especially for developing nations. We have an initiative right now based out of Rwanda, Smart Cities Africa, again, with the participation of a lot of the ministers that is also looking at raising funds and working with multilateral development banks to provide such funding for national programs. The second part is the uptake of the citizens digital literacy. I think that was also covered by Alice, and I definitely, you know, subscribe to that as a very important key success factor. And then the last one has to be, you know, in terms of the ability to, again, think about it always in a holistic way, right? And prioritize, because what, you know, it's what I call the Maslow hierarchy for cities. Smart cities, you know, in a city that doesn't have access to, you know, sort of like a wastewater system is going to be very different from a fully developed city. So how to prioritize and really invest the limited resources that we have in those use cases and applications that meet our most urgent needs.
Thank you. Thank you, Hazem. And thank you, by the way, for mentioning Rwanda, because I can announce it now, but in a few weeks from now, we'll be releasing the book that is the companion product to this index. The first edition of the book, which is released by IMD and SUTD, that first book was called 16 Shades of Smart. It took like 16 cases of smart cities around the world. The second volume will come out in a few weeks from now. And Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, is one of the examples we look into. There are indeed very exciting examples from all around the world in cities that are not there yet, but are doing what is needed to become inclusive and open smart cities. So thank you for that again. We're getting now to the last round of questions. So without wanting to rub it in, Koon Hean, you said Singapore is far from perfect and we're ready to discuss everything we did wrong and where we had to adjust. So let me push it a little bit further. Can you think of any city, smart or not, around the world that has something that Singapore doesn't have and you wish Singapore had to be an even better smart city?
Yes, it's always great to learn from everyone. You know, when I first started on this smart nation journey, I remember visiting many smart cities or aspiring smart cities. And I noticed there were sort of two approaches. One is pretty much top down and the other one was bottom up. I think some of the European cities were pretty much bottom up, you know, encouraging the private sector to play a more ground up role with ideas and by throwing out a lot of data. So I must say in Singapore, initially, the leadership for Smart Nation has really come primarily from the government. But it would have been very good to democratize the initiatives and to provide a very supportive environment that encourage more ground-up ideas. Actually, we really want more ground-up ideas and to get more buy-in from everyone, from the men and women in the street. So, but I must say that over the last few years, we've tried to make those shifts, and there is a perceptible shift in that direction. For example, we've now nurtured an ecosystem for startups. So we really want more initiative from the private sector and from the ground up. So I'm just happy to say that after trying many ways and putting in incentives and a supportive environment, we now have something like 3,800 tech-enabled startups and about, 190 intermediaries of accelerators and incubators. So we are quite happy that now we do have one of the most developed startup ecosystems in the world. And I think we have about like 10 unicorns right now. And we did even manage to bring in some 5.5 billion last year, Singapore dollars, in the presence of the pandemic. So I think we are wanting to, we see a lot of very rich ecosystems in other cities where it's very much ground up, very broad-based participation. And I think that's where we would like to be.
Thank you. And now asking Alice another question on something that we've been touching upon in the earlier part of this conversation is if we try to look beyond the pandemic, okay, what will the world of tomorrow be like? There are signs that the recovery worldwide is a strong one. Okay, we are seeing good signs, positive signs, especially in Asia Pacific, but also in other parts of the world. There are also signs that this recovery, dynamic as it may be, may also increase inequalities around the world and also sometimes domestically between those who have the skills to be part of digital transformation and those who don't have. How do you see smart cities playing into that? Will they be an element that may indeed increase these inequalities, or can they contribute to diminish that possibility?
So first of all, what I would say is that COVID-19 managed to shine a light on many of the inequalities that already existed in our cities. And many of those challenges are basically chronic challenges, whether it's affordable housing, for example, is a classic example of inequality that we see in cities right around the world. But that problem existed and was systemic across the world before COVID-19. So I think that COVID-19 has been positive in managing to shine a light on these inequalities that exist in our society, in our cities around the world. And in that context, you know, city leaders are really focusing on what can we do about it. So in that sense, I see that as a huge positive. In terms of, you know, doing something about it, I think one of the big challenges which Hazem highlighted, you know, in his last answer is around funding. So cities, unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, have had their budgets severely impacted. And what we're seeing is huge deficits in city budgets around the world. So that, of course, impacts their ability to offer infrastructure and services within cities. But also cities rely heavily on national government transfers as well. And again, their borrowing has been hugely accelerated during the COVID-19 crisis to deal with the emergency that was in front of them. So again, they're constrained in terms of the amount of money that they can transfer to city government. I guess the other sources of finance that are tapped to a lesser extent are multilateral development banks and the private sector. And they will have to play an increasing role, and cities will have to find a way to tap those sources of finance in the future to respond to many of these challenges. So in that context, what we hear from the private sector is there's lots of money available, there's a lack of bankable projects. And what they mean by that is infrastructure and service projects that have the risk profile, and the structure to actually attract investment. So that means cities are going to have to double down on finding the capabilities to be able to prepare projects in such a way that they attract investment. So that's a general comment into financing the infrastructure and services needed in terms of a recovery. Turning to smart city technology, I think, what I've highlighted already, and I think everybody has highlighted today, is technology is an enabler. So it is an enabler of driving change, and it should certainly be seen in that way. But in terms of understanding the change that you've got to deliver, you've got to understand what exactly are the citizens' needs within your city if it is actually going to be of value to citizens within your city. And that means you've got to actively engage with all vulnerable groups and citizen groups within your city to understand their needs. But also, it can only assist citizens within the city if you have digital literacy and digital skills and digital accessibility. So it's imperative that cities also focus on those aspects if you are going to ensure that smart city technology is going to be of benefit and drive inclusion rather than exclusion.
Thank you, Alice. As you mentioned before, in your top priorities, the importance of funding. And Alice just stressed the fact that multilateral banks are one of the players that needs to be more involved in efforts to support smart cities, especially in emerging countries, as a way to reduce those possible inequalities. Let me just mention a little bit of my own experience when I was at the World Bank. I was hoping to start a program about cities. And the response I got from the World Bank was very clear and very logical. It was, the reason why we are involved in development issues is based on our ability to lend money at preferential rates. We can lend money to sovereign nations. We cannot lend money to other entities. Therefore, it is unlikely that we will be able to move into the city space. That was some 10 years ago. In your own experience of seeking the funding and keeping in mind what Alice just told us about the fact that COVID actually put governments back on center stage because they had this ability to go beyond budgetary orthodoxy and mobilize funding that was not imaginable a few years before. Do you see that happening? In other words, are the potential sources of financing for smart cities coming up to the front line?
We're seeing isolated cases, basically, but not at scale, right? Of again, multilateral development banks working with, national smart cities programs, innovative and creative mayors that are, properly aligned with national government, because that's not always the case. So we're seeing more of that happening, than we did before. In terms of the ability of multilateral banks to work directly or indirectly with cities. So we're seeing some of that, not enough, not at scale. We're seeing, as Alice mentioned, new models for partnerships with the private sector as well. Be it in the smart city space, with a lot of creative partnerships whether it's pay as you go or as a service, and many of these sort of like models that a city can work with the private sector on. The issue we have that we're not scaling up, and we don't have enough visibility about all of these successful examples and how to make sure that they are the majority rather than the exception.
Thank you. While we were discussing, I was keeping an eye on the Q&A list we have, and some very interesting questions have come up. I think that most of them have been answered by the discussion that we've been having and the examples you described. Some others have to do with methodology. Konstantin in Moscow, for instance, is asking us, how do you use the Human Development Index groups to assign countries and what is the relevance of that in the index. Tamer from Jordan is asking, why is not Jordan? There's no Jordanian city on the list. I think all of these issues are being addressed in the documents that are being put online. I would encourage you to refer to those for lack of time now to address those very interesting points. And of course, we'd be very eager to pursue that online. So since we are reaching now the end of this hour, let me now turn to all of you. And again, in the same sequence. So I'd like to hear from Koon Hean first, and then Alice, and then Hazem. If you wanted this audience that we have today for this global launch to remember one word, okay? What is one keyword that for you is going to define the future challenges or future opportunities of smart cities? What would that word or phrase be? Koon Hean, you first.
I'll use a phrase. I think one word is too scanty. Well, I think smart cities of the future should be digitally inclusive. It must increase our resilience and must be future focused for growth and innovation. I thought that would be my summary sentence.
Thank you. Alice?
I'm going to cheat and use two words. One is outcome. So I think cities need to focus on the outcome that they need to deliver for their citizens and the role of technology in that. And the second is enabler, to think of technology as an enabler rather than a silver bullet in addressing their problems.
Thank you. Hazem, your word
again. I'm gonna sort of like cheat a little bit and repeat something that I've always been saying. It's not about technology, right? So just we have to constantly remind ourselves it's not about technology. And as a computer engineer, I also have that tendency as well to think technology first, but smart cities are not about technology.
Thank you. So thank you very much to all of you. I think that just these final words could define what we are trying to do today, whether we consider the acceleration of digital transformation as an opportunity, but also a challenge. The fact that it's not about technology, and indeed everything we want to do in the way we measure smart cities, in the way we develop smart cities, in the way we imagine smart cities needs to be human-centric. That's what Koon Hean called winning hearts earlier. And it needs to be future-oriented. It needs to be outcome-focused, and it needs to remember that however powerful technology can be as an enabler, as Alice reminded us several times, it is not to be put at the front. It would be putting the horse behind the cart, or the cart before the horses, whichever sequence you want to choose, than to start with technological solutions. And I think COVID has proved us how important that was. So if I may dare to inject my own final word, I will have two actually. The first one would be youth. I think the future of cities will be determined by younger people. So the ways in which we can listen to younger generation, involve them in the design of these future cities, make sure that we are winning their hearts, and they will be able to winning more hearts, will be critically important. And the second word, the very last one, will be a big thank you. A big thank you to our audience for raising important questions, even if we didn't have the time to address them directly. And a very warm thank you to our panelists and to both SUTD and IMD for being such wonderful partners in this endeavor. So until next year, thank you again. See you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.